Welcome, good evening everybody. Bienvenidos sean todos ustedes a esta transmisión. Don't worry, that was the only part that was being spoken on Spanish, because this is our second episode in English, and I am really delighted to have this guest. I have to admit that I am sort of fanboy of his work. I have read pretty much most of his novels, and I am missing perhaps some of his short stories or collaborations that we're going to mention after this. But first, let me introduce you. Our special guest in here is Ian Tregillis. Ian, how are you doing?
I am doing great. Thank you very much for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
No, we are really glad to have you in here, and thank you once again for accepting this invitation. We're going to have a blast talking about storytelling and about a lot of elements that you are an expert, like world building. And of course, allow me to introduce you one colleague of such lethal cunning, Blanca Lopez. She's in here. You already know her, but she needs no more presentation. She's the smartest woman I have ever known, and she's the smartest woman in this transmission. Blanca, how are you doing?
Quite fine, and I'm very thankful for your invitation, and of course, I'm very thrilled and excited about meeting Ian tonight.
And Ian, one of the things that you have to know about him is that he's actually a scientist, and he has a lot of knowledge of, a lot of topics. But right now we're going to be talking about some of his books, and actually about how you can combine different elements in storytelling. Because, for example, with Blanca, we have spoken about science fiction. For example, in the last jam session, we spoke with Tom Merritt about how scientific elements could be combined so the story could move forward. And for example, in some of the books, specifically in Bitter Seeds, the first novel, I believe that's your first novel. Is that correct, Ian?
Yep.
And I was delighted because you combine different elements from the technological elements, but also some mystical elements in there. Can you give us the brief synopsis about your first novel, Bitter Seeds, please?
Sure. Let's see if I can remember what it's about. It's been a while.
Yes.
In a nutshell, the idea is it's about a secret war between magic and mad science taking place behind the scenes during World War II and the Cold War. There's a group of British spies who use very, very dangerous magic. They negotiate with demons to fight soldiers on the other side who have unusual abilities given to them by mad science. And as you can imagine, things very rapidly start to go wrong for both sides.
Exactly. And for example, one of the things that I found really interesting about this, well, it's a series. There are 3 novels on this trilogy. Well, that's why it's a trilogy. And for example, you explore during different times. It starts in World War II, then it moves forward, and then you play a little bit with time. I don't want to give any more spoilers in case that guys, if you're watching this, you better pause it a little bit, go buy one of the books. The digital copies, it's really easy to get. And then, well, after you buy it, you can join us once again in the conversation. Don't worry, there won't be any spoilers. But for example, basically it's like, I don't know, like German superpower X-Men, I don't know, against British warlocks, if I recall correctly. And one of the things that I found the most interesting is that, for example, even for magic, you have rules. And for example, I mentioned this because, I don't know, in comic books, like Marvel Comics, when they wanted to change something, Joe Quesada, the chief editor before the current editor, mentioned that, well, we can use the magical element and we don't have to explain it because it's magic. But for example, Ian, in your case, I love that you have certain rules. And yes, it's magic, but for example, in the case of the warlocks, you have to pay a price if you want to use something of these magical elements, which is why it was most interesting. Where did you get this idea for this alternative reality so you can establish these certain rules? Where did the inspiration came from?
Let's see. The beginning, the seed idea was an article that I read long time ago about a real secret project during the war where the British had actually considered building ships out of ice. You know, like they were going to build giant aircraft carriers out of ice because ice doesn't sink, right? So it's not such a crazy idea. And I guess because I have a weird imagination, I read that and then I thought, wow, what if they had started doing that and then the Axis powers had a spy who could control fire with his mind. So they sent him into the shipyards to melt all of these ships. You know, I'm a pretty lowbrow kind of writer, so that's the kind of idea that appeals to me. But then from that, the whole series sprang from that concept, which never happens or appears in the books. But once I realized, so I had these, you know, Axis spies with unusual powers. I needed to come up with something on the other side to, you know, make it a balanced fight. And so I thought, okay, they'll start using magic. But I realized pretty quickly that if there was no price to the magic, they could basically do anything, you know, and the sort of the consensual basis of reality would fall apart, as one of my writing mentors likes to say. So then I had to think hard about the rules and the prices.
Mm-hmm. And for example, as you mentioned, you have to balance some sort. And after all, perhaps it's not at the level of technology versus a different kind of technology, because you know that it has been. It was Isaac Asimov which we mentioned that or Carl Sagan, I don't know, that mentioned that magic is just technology that we don't have the grasp yet. So, so for example, in here it's something really interesting. Blanca, we're going with you. Any of the do you remember any of any other kind of storytelling where you actually have a combination of mystical or magical elements, like this is the case in particular, against technological elements? I don't know, in video games, in movies, in books. Any other reference?
I was thinking, first of all, the thing about balancing magic and the rules of magic. I was thinking about Dungeons and Dragons. Even though you might be a sorcerer or a wizard, there are very strict rules. There are things you can do, things you cannot even dream about unless you get some levels, and that demands that the imaginary world faces you with stronger foes. For instance, I was also thinking about. For instance, role-playing games, there's a special story in Vampire that's about cyberpunk science fiction. And there's a special clan of vampires, the Tremor, that use a lot of magic. So if your character is a Tremor vampire, you face the challenge of adapting all your magic, or for instance, the thing about seeing the aura, looking at the future. There are many things that might be obstaculized or be because of technology. I was thinking about also in Vampire, the other clan, the Simis, all their magic, the Kuldun that needs dirt, ground, and special elements that in that world, cyberpunk world, are not easy to find. It's challenging to mix technology with magic, but it's been done. It's been done in a very successful and interesting and also appealing way for gamers. So I think the thing is how you, in your narrative system, establish the rules by which both magic and technology can work. Also, for instance, several chapters of this game, well, the Final Fantasy series, there's a lot of magic, but there's also these items that are Magitech, that are also some kind of hybrid between magical items. They're somewhere in between magical items and technological aircraft, no? So I guess it's about how the narrative universe is being built. It's not that they are, no, you either use technology or magic. No, never like that. They can be blend. However, you must be very smart to do it in order to keep the verisimilitude of the universe working. I've seen several examples in which they try to mix elements from science fiction and from fantasy worlds, and they end up having such a mess that it's under the excuse that it's magic. No, it's not a Deus Ex. No. Magic also has its rules, and they are very specific. It depends on the author and what you are going to allow the gamers to do and to achieve, because magic is also not something that is powerful because you're powerful because that's how it works. No. You have to mature your magic, to learn your magic and develop it. And so it has also rules about, let's call it, the magical coming of age of a magician, of a warlock, of a sorcerer. I think I dare say, the fantasy rules can even get more hard, can get harder than the ones of science fiction. Science fiction has very specific rules, but they are established by the world, let's call it, in the first chapter. That's it. But when you start using fantasy elements such as magic, you must be very careful. What kind of magic are you talking about? How does it work? How does it grow? How does it develop? Who can use it? Who can't? I think that set of rules is very important for the narrative system to work.
Exactly. And for example, besides the combination, for example, that we can have between in this case, mystical elements, magical elements, one of the most important things that you have to check, besides the rules that you establish in your own world, is also that you can feel like it's a regular element, something that you actually can touch, and it needs to feel real, basically. And for example, Ian, one of the things that I like the most, particularly in your original trilogy, it's how you combine historical elements. As we mentioned, the story starts at World War II. But for example, when it comes forward in the second book, you have certain peculiarities that you have to start creating in the world that you are building. So I am really interested in to see how do you start drafting, how do you start crafting this kind of environment, because you're based obviously in the reality that we already know, in the history that we already know. But for example, you have already take some steps away from the regular timeline to establish an alternative timeline. So I am interested to see how do you actually start working with that.
It's always a bit of a challenge for me because I don't have a background in history. So I always feel like I'm skating on thin ice because a lot of people know much more history than I do. So I look for, I take the approach, what are pieces of history that I've heard of? What are, big events or pieces of the world that I'm familiar with? And I sort of take myself as sort of the base reader. So, assuming if I've heard of something, then people who are more knowledgeable than me will also be familiar with this. So in the second book, in the sequel to Bitter Seeds, early on in the book, I tried to drop some pretty big, blatant hints that the world was different than the one we knew. The book opens in the 1960s, but instead of a Berlin Wall, there's talk of a Paris Wall. We've learned that the Soviet Union has conquered Europe, and they've collectivized all the wineries. And so, there's no good wine that comes out of France anymore. It all comes from South America. That I thought was, okay, I know very little about wine, but if my reading audience is anything like me, they will understand that is a change. Whether or not it's plausible is a totally different question, but they'll get that that's different. So I try to be very. I don't go for subtlety. Let's put it that way.
Well, and after all, it's a world that you're building, so you can be as subtle or as I don't know, as spectacular as you want. And for example, Blanca, I know that you are a big fan of one novel and that has been developed in television that I actually like a lot, and it also deals with alternative history, which is the case of the man in the high castle. So, for example, could you mention any of the elements that you find about the alternative history that is being established in there that are like something like guidelines if you want to write another story about alternative history?
Well, alternative history is, I guess, a popular method to explore and to even play with elements that maybe they are facts, they might be realities, but how about changing the order or the priority of the historical variables? How can we use other elements that were not necessarily played as we can read history backwards, no? So I was thinking about, yes, the man in the high castle. How about the Axis wins the Second World War II? And that's a very provocative hypothesis. What else would how the world would look like? How was it geographically divided? Can be real that there be really only one axis? For instance, in the book we already see how the Italian faction was cut out, no? And I was thinking about another game. It is called Battleground Europe. It's a morgue. It's about World War II, and there were many players. We were there connected, but we all wanted to be Axis. No one wanted to play the Allies. So we were waiting for D-Day. Well, today, I am absolutely sure the Axis will win that war. Yes, it was very asymmetrical. You can't control that in games. However, when you develop a fiction, you must keep that in balance. Say, okay, the Axis won, but what happened to the other countries? What happened between the Japanese culture and the German culture? This is going to be a spoiler. We are already starting to see during season 2 that they are already in conflict. So how about the fascism facing another racial and cultural possibility, even though they are allies? I think it's a very provocative hypothesis. Not only about how about the other side, the bad guys winning the war. No, it's not only that. What happens next? How the society is profiled, how it's built. So I guess that's the real challenge about counterfactual alternative science fiction stories. How we dare to imagine a world in which based on these same elements, can be developed in some other way, you know? And I guess Philip K. Dick is very successful at drawing us a very clear idea of how socially, politically, and even economically that kind of world might have worked, you know?
Right.
That's a tough thing to do, that taking that exciting and, as you say, very provocative premise, and then building the rest of the world around it. You know, the nuts and bolts. Like you say, how does it actually work? You know, how does the economy work? What do people do for a living? You know, that's the really hard stuff. And I always find that very challenging. So I've read The Man in the High Castle, but I haven't seen the show. But
it's excellent.
More interested in watching it. Yeah, I've heard it's quite good. I've heard the first season is quite good.
Yeah, and actually, the second season gets even better because the creators, they change showrunner, but they got a little bit more of the freedom. And for example, one of the things I was in a presentation with one of the producers and one of the new showrunner, and he actually mentioned that one of the toughest things, and that they actually tried to explode more in the second season, was actually about the creation of this alternative universe. And one of the specific things that they established that was the hardest was the creation of the music. Because after World War II, you don't have the rock. For example, you don't have the music from Elvis, you don't have the Beatles. So how can you establish a reality where an element that is so common as the music is not present? Obviously, you will have the music, but how different will it be if the influences that you have, well, obviously are more European, but in this case are more Germanic. So that's some of the things that I was fascinated with the process of world building.
That's really smart. Yeah, that's a great observation. Yeah, because music is so, like when you watch TV and a movie, right? Like the musical cues are so important to tell you what's going to happen or what your mood is supposed to be. But if they can't rely on, decades of sort of musical history, for Western viewers, then that's a really interesting problem. That's pretty cool.
Mm-hmm. And well, I want to move a little bit forward. Obviously, we will be talking about alternative history, but move forward in your career as a writer, but perhaps backwards in time. And I actually was looking for the different covers. Well, I have the digital versions for the next trilogy that you established, which is the first one is the Milkweed Triptych, and the second one is the Alchemy Wars, the Mechanical, the Rising, and the Liberation. Please don't spoil something because I have already read the Mechanical. I am halfway through the Rising.
Okay.
And I love the design of the covers. But for example, I was just checking and I found some of the alternative covers for international versions, and I was like, wow, this is really cool. I mean, I love the original design, but it was like, okay, this is something that actually you have the combination of, once again, perhaps mystical elements with a different reality, because it's a world that in this case is not dominated by the Axis powers, as we mentioned in a different situation with the other works in the case of the man in the high castle. But in here we have a different power, and I really found fascinating that you actually took a step away, because the great colonizers of the New World are neither the Spaniards and are neither the British, but a different power. What is the power that actually is reigning at the beginning of the Alchemy Wars, Ian?
It's the Netherlands, the Dutch. Their golden age never ended.
It's really fascinating because also you add obviously a different taste, because it's I don't know, the great empires. Obviously we have a different colonies established by different countries from Europe, but for example in this case it was one of the countries that didn't, I don't know, it's not as common to think of them as conquerors in this case of the New World, and they use a different element. They use alchemy. Obviously, that's the reason of the title of the series, and it's in a really clever way. Because after all, well, alchemy, it's just chemistry in, let's say, in a less in a previous state, but they use it to give life to different characters that you have in there. And for example, one of the quotes that I find fascinating from the book that actually help you to get more into the story, and it's not because it's a combination of alternative history with some other elements, but this is the creation of human conflicts or mechanical conflicts, perhaps. And one of the quotes that I love the most is and I'm reading this, is free will was a vacuum, a negative space. It was the absence of coercion, the absence of compulsion, the absence of agony. And you're using this in Jax, if I'm not mistaken, in one of the main characters. And it was really interesting to see a mechanical element used as a character who actually has a conscious and a way of thinking that it deals with a lot of human emotions. So I am interested to see what were like your inspirations for the developing of these characters and these kind of conflicts.
Well, let's see. The way I started that idea was I wanted to write a story about a mechanical man And I thought, and that's all I knew. And so I thought, well, I'll start my world building with what are these things called, these mechanical men. And I thought, well, if they're built from clock parts, they're probably very noisy. So there's probably some slang based on the noises that their bodies make. So I ended up coming up with the word clacker. And then I don't know how my brain works. I decided that sounded Dutch to me. I really honestly don't know why, but I did. And then sort of almost instantly, the premise came into my head that, there was this Dutch scientist and clockmaker back in the 1600s named Christian Huygens, who was I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong, but he was a contemporary of Isaac Newton. And I knew that Isaac Newton did a lot of alchemical research, and he thought that was going to be his great work. So I sort of instantly, I thought, well, what if this Dutch scientist had stolen all of Newton's alchemical research and then combined alchemy and clockmaking to make mechanical men? Because of course you could totally do that, right? So then I thought, well, so if they have this sort of limitless source of free labor, these immortal slaves that never get tired and have to do everything they're told, the story really needs a viewpoint from the point of view of one of those mechanical men, so that we understand what they're going through. We understand their slavery and the agony that they feel. And that meant that I had to make Jax, I hope, interesting, or at least relatable. And to do that, I had to give him emotions. And that actually worked out, because I realized, well, that's pretty nice, because then we see that these are even though they have very strange mechanical bodies, these beings are basically human. I mean, they're very human in their hearts and their minds and their souls, but they're not free. And they're enslaved in a particularly insidious way, where they can't even really, even their thoughts are constrained. And the things that they can do are constrained, because if they do anything that's the least bit disloyal, they feel this terrible pain. So yeah, I'm very mercenary, I guess you could say. So I just needed a point of view character that people could follow and would want to follow.
And you have different characters in there. And for example, Blanca, I don't know if you are familiar with the mechanical, for example, but if not, any other cases where you remember, for example, the conflict between, well, obviously man and machine, but in this case, the machine has even more human conflicts than perhaps the humans?
Blade Runner.
Oh. There you are. Yeah.
Definitely. I was, just as you were speaking, Ian, I was thinking about the internal conflicts that the replicants went through. Well, they end up being more human than even humans.
Yeah.
Also, I was thinking about this anime series called Full Metal Alchemist. Mm-hmm. That it's about this young boy. He's pretty much steampunk. His parts, mechanic parts, and he builds up some kind of robot. But through the development of the story, we can watch how that robot that it started being something like only a machine, it grows up to be pretty human. He's his best friend, he's his pal, and the story is built around the friendship that is built between the both of them. No, so it's a very interesting conflict, since not only about the story you are telling us about, since they are machines, but they are showing us in a more vivid way how humans feel and how humans face human conflicts that are inherent to their condition. Right now, I'm finding very interesting, for instance, the thing about these slaves that are very restricted, however, they live forever. And how will a human conflict can be developed, considering that you are not a mortal creature, you are going to live forever. How does that affect the internal conflict? No, I was thinking about one of your characters from what Dr. Gottlieb saw. This girl with the hair made of wire.
Oh yeah.
How she reminded me, for instance, William Gibson's Mona Lisa Overdrive. These very sensitive characters that are human, but also powerful, and they are quite complex. However, they are not supposed to be totally human. However, they end up being more human than human. I think that kind of complexity gives this kind of stories a great appeal, and they are also very provocative. Not because we are reading machines as if they are human, but we are taking the human traits and investing other kind of beings. And you human, watch how your conflicts, how your traits look from an outside eye. No, and I think that's very interesting.
Yeah, that's I don't know that I fully realized that that was what I was going to end up trying to do when I got started. But the more I got into it, I discovered sort of what you're saying. I think it sounds like you understand this a lot better than I do, even after I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. But yeah, it had to be pointed out to me as I was writing the Mechanical that, and its sequels, that the most human character in the series is the mechanical man and his colleagues, the other mechanicals. And I, if I were not as honest as I am, I would say, oh yeah, I meant to do that, because clearly it's really an exploration of the nature of humanity. But of course I wasn't smart enough to see that when I started. I just sort of blundered into it along the way.
And for example, it's kind of interesting because, well, you deal with the different aspect of human personality, and you can transfer the different emotions or different conflicts with these different kind of characters. And the character that Blanca was mentioning, for example, it's really interesting because it's the scariest character from your original trilogy, and also because she doesn't have a particular power that it's, I don't know, like something that you will see on a superhero. She's used really smart, and for example, she used get a grasp of the reality in a way that we cannot actually see. I remember one of the scenes, and I believe it's in the second novel, if I'm not mistaken, in the Coldest War, where you see the fruition of something that she planted on the Second World War, and it was actually how to get one of her partners killed. So when she needed to get out of the Russian prison, used a simple recipient will be in there. And it was like, well, that's scary as hell, and it's a lot of forward planning. And she is a daughter of, well, I cannot say it in here, but she's a mean person. But actually, you get the grasp in the third novel that everything that she was doing, it was for a purpose. It wasn't necessarily evil. Oh, wow. But it actually was a greater plan. And it's something that perhaps you couldn't get in a regular character. For example, in the main character, in Marsh, if I'm not mistaken. So it was really good.
Oh, thank you. Well, I'm always delighted when I hear people talk about Gretel. I was very, very, very proud of some of the things that I came up with for her. You're exactly right. You're right on the money. I wanted, all through that trilogy, I'm sort of playing a game where I wanted to hint to the reader that Gretel, she can see the future, but we never see what she sees, at least not for a long time. And so I wanted to hint to the reader that possibly, the people who made her, the Nazis see her as their great tool for winning the war. But maybe, just maybe, she's thinking more than 3 or 4 years down the line. She's actually thinking 20 or 30 years down the line. So when we first meet her as an adult, in chapter 1 of Bitter Seeds, she has already planned out everything through the end of the second novel. And that includes, there's a 20-year gap between the books that I had to put in there for various reasons. And so I wanted to start the second novel with paying off something that Gretel did, something weird and seemingly random that she does in Bitter Seeds, suddenly pays off in a big, big way, 20 years later. Because I thought that was a really vivid way. I hoped that would be a very vivid way to show readers that she really does have a plan. And, my thesis for Gretel was that if you have perfect precognition and if you are a psychopath, you basically have an unbeatable superpower.
Mm-hmm.
As long as you're seeing far enough ahead, you're completely unbeatable. Because the people who are trying to fight you don't even know that they're supposed to fight you until after you've already figured out the whole chess game. So that was really fun. She's a fun character, and I kind of miss writing her.
Well, perhaps it will come again in a short story or something like that. I don't know, or in a parallel universe. I don't know. We never know that. A different timeline.
That's true.
And for example, Blanca, one question. Did you have the chance to watch a very successful TV show from HBO, which was called Westworld?
Yes.
What did you think about that TV show?
I guess it's fine. I didn't get very involved with it. I think it's a good premise. How about it's not exactly an alternative world? Well, yes. However, what I miss a lot is that internal conflict, the character building. I guess the world is good. Well, it's well built, but something about the characters is still missing. No, I don't know. That's because of that was just me, but many people like it a lot. I find it not very provocative, but it was very compelling, if we can call it like that. However, there are things that I might like to rescue from the story. The thing about how they're working out differences between different groups. I think it's very in contrast with history and the history of colonization and the colonization of the west of the United States, for instance. It's not very violent, and I think they are building an alternative in which, through more complexity, because it's way more complex, they can manage to live in a world like that, no? So even though it's not one of my favorites, I recognize that it's very well. It's well written.
And I mentioned this example because if you people, well, obviously it's easier to get that reference from a TV show, from a movie, that perhaps from a book. But however, if you like that kind of show, I actually like it a lot. I seriously recommend you to grab a copy of any of the, well, obviously from the beginning of the Mechanical trilogy. And Ian, I am just amazed of the polished covers from your book. The artists,
aren't they great? They're amazing.
I mean, obviously the American art is great, but for example, now that I was just scanning, I was like, oh man, I have to buy now a different copy for a book that I already have. But the cover art is just beautiful and actually matches a lot of the ideas that you have in there, and that obviously you are writing in a lot of in a better way. I don't want to establish a comparison between the both works. I mean, the TV show and the novels. But for example, I really like the establishment of the mechanical emotions that you have in here, and also the comparison and even the I don't know, the switching that you have even in the first book, when one of the human characters just realizes that, well, perhaps he's now more machine than man, Where do you have the ethical dilemma in there? Where do I stand as a person now that I am not fully as a person as I was? Perhaps I wasn't as human as I thought that I was. And then you have the contraposition, specifically with the character of Jax, where you have all the elements for, well, as in Blade Runner, of the human conflict in there. So I would like to get a little bit more in the world of the mechanical. We already established where it is going. I mean, like in what kind of reality, where a different empire actually is the dominant. But for example, some of the references that you establish in there seem, I don't know, peculiar, because you even have religious elements in there at play. And I remember in the very first chapter of the first novel, it's like a witch hunt, in this case for an artificial creation. Can you tell us a little bit more about the elements like this one that you included in this series?
Sure. Like I say, I because I'm not very knowledgeable about history, I lean on people who are. And when I was describing very early on, I was describing this idea for this series, that the Dutch had invented mechanical men in the late 1600s and sort of took over the world. A friend of mine said, "Oh, well, that's perfect, because you're making a major change to history right in the Netherlands, right when the Netherlands were at war with France and other continental powers." And so, England and Spain and France and the Netherlands. And so I learned a bit about that, and I realized, oh, well, gosh, I'm not really, I guess you could say I don't have a lot of faith in human nature. So I thought, oh, well, maybe it's plausible that if the Netherlands had these mechanical men right when they needed them to fend off Louis XIV, a very convenient way to frame what they were doing as not as slavery, but as sort of an ethical imperative, was to frame it with religion, right? So they sort of framed it as, well, the clackers are our servants, and they serve our Calvinist Protestant ideals, and they protect us against those horrible Catholics. And so it became sort of a religious and philosophical. They used religious and philosophical arguments to justify their lifestyle, which is built on the backs of these eternal, undying mechanical men who are suffering all the time. You could call me a cynic, I guess, but that's how it turned into a religious conflict. Yeah, it was a great observation from this friend of mine. We were having coffee, and I realized, oh, that's great. That's because it needed another layer. The conflict needed another layer. It couldn't just be this country versus that country. There had to be, what did they believe that made it worth maintaining this conflict for hundreds of years? And I don't know, I think sometimes religion is good for that.
Yeah, and it's also interesting because when we have the presentation of the New World, specifically the American continent, obviously you have that influence in how the culture actually evolved in here. Religion is one of the main factors. And for example, here in Mexico, we were colonized by the Spaniards. Obviously, they had a different cultural reference, religious reference in this case, in comparison with the Dutch, with the French, with the Portuguese, with any other country. And for example, that actually gets into the culture that is being developed afterwards. Blanca, one question, and perhaps I'm going a little bit off the main topic in here, but did you get the chance to watch the recently released on Netflix TV show of Castlevania?
No, and everyone is telling me I cannot get out of my house if I haven't seen it. Well, I need to see it. I have just a little comment about the thing, the religious
element.
Element. I was thinking about Gustav Mayring's The Golem. The thing about so yes, the Jewish figure that is it's an automat. pretty much an artifact that comes to life through magic. And well, I guess we in the Western cultures, we are very familiar with that desire of bringing something to life. Even thinking about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, we are using technology, we are using scientific method, but the will to control and to create something powerful that can keep us safe and can also help us defeat our enemies, I think is it's a trait of the human condition. You know? I think and nothing has changed since the 19th century. We're still using science as some sort of religion. We have faith in science. Even it's shown already, it has limits. There are things science cannot answer, things science cannot solve. We are still vouching for science. You know? So I think the bond between religion and science is a very rich field of human conflict you can work with. Well, I think so.
And
yeah, it is. It definitely is.
And funny that you mentioned that because, for example, one of your most recent works, Ian, it was in the serialized fiction of the witch who came in from the cold. And actually, one of the chapters where looking here at the Amazon web site, it's actually the golem.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. The first episode that I wrote of the witch who came in from the cold. I think it's the 5th episode of season 1.
Oh,
that's right. I actually had forgotten that. It's called the Golem. In that case, it's a reference to the Golem of Prague. But which of course, that story had been in the back of my mind when I was thinking about the clackers as well. They have characteristics that are meant to be sort of an homage to the Golem of Prague and other golems like that. But yeah, I guess you've just pointed out to me that I'm really fascinated with that idea even more than I realized because I keep writing stories about golems.
And there you have it. So we're pretty much getting almost to the end of this transmission. I want to remember to the viewers that we have in here, sorry, or to the listeners. We are actually going to give a couple of digital copies of one. We're going to be giving one digital copy of Bitter Seeds and one of the mechanical. The instruction actually will be in the YouTube video and actually in the post that we have been retweeting from the beginning. There are the instructions. They are really easy. This is just the warning, so go to the post. Actually, I'm going to show you right now. Here's the post with the live streaming that we have in here in Churros y Palomitas. And at the very end, after the end credits, you have the instructions which are really, really easy. You have a couple of links and you have to pick your favorite quote of each book and post it in the comments. And actually that will let us know what they like the most about these particular books. But before we actually finish these transmissions, Ian, I'd like to know, you have been working in short fiction, in this case in serialized fiction, and obviously you have 7 novels and some short stories. Do you have something that you're writing now that you're going to release in the future, something that you want to tease us about?
Let's see. So I just started. I took about a year off from working on books. I had been working with Cereal Box doing the Witch Who Came In From the Cold, just to keep my toes in the pond to make sure I was still writing. But for various reasons, I had gotten kind of burned out, so I took some time off from writing books. But I'm starting to do research for another book, which I don't know why, but it's another secret alternate history concept. I don't know why I keep having these ideas, because like I say, I don't know anything about history, but the only ideas that appeal to me are always take some piece of history and then add magic to it. So before we started recording, I actually moved my monitor so that what you can't see right outside the frame is giant stacks of books, like here and here, and a notepad where I'm making all my notes. So I hope before long I'll have another book in progress.
All right.
But I'm doing the research ahead of time this time, so it's taking longer than I hoped.
Yeah, and well, perhaps you don't know history, but you actually know how to convince us that you actually do by creating a different timeline. So that's really clever because you know your history and you convince us that that's the real history, or at least the history that we want to read. In case that you just to illustrate a little bit, this is, I believe, an accurate description of how your office is right now.
It's maybe not quite that bad, but that is not actually the office that I'm sitting in. Doesn't look terribly different from that right now.
And you also
I wish my office were that organized, however.
And with a cat with flashing eyes.
Actually, my cat is right here.
Oh, I
see. My cat is just off screen.
Nice. Well, before we actually go, I want to let the people who are watching us know where they can find more about more information about the people who have been in this transmission. In your case, Ian, they can really easily follow you in Twitter, which your handle is Tregillis. I am actually going to say it in Spanish. I don't know why. In twitter.com/Tregillis. Sorry, I do it better that way. Where you actually keep us updated with the different things that you have been working, or use general information, right?
Yeah, just so people know I'm still alive. I'm not always so great about updating my website, but Twitter's so easy. That way, people know I haven't fallen into a ditch or something.
That's the easiest way, but actually they can get to your webpage, which I love the design. I know that the design that you have in there has been pretty much from the beginning, but I love all the elements that you have in there. Sort of, I don't know.
I like the animations.
Exactly.
The round thing that looks like a compass.
Oh, thank you. The guy who designed the site for me is a good friend of mine, and he's kind of a mad genius. So I just let him do whatever he wanted to do, and it was great.
And also, one thing that I forgot to mention, but I have to do it right now, and I have it in here. I really love when you took some time to diverge from your main style or your main narrative when you wrote something more than night. Perhaps it was something that at the moment I felt a little bit identified with some of the characters. No, I wasn't a detective who pretended to be old-fashioned or something like that. Well, actually, I kind of was. But actually, I love the writing. One of the things that made it a little bit easier is that it wasn't a trilogy. It was just a single book. But it was really fast-paced. So I was like, it was a page-turner for me. We didn't mention it, but that's actually one of the best ways to get into Ian's work. You can get something more than night. And it's a really different style that you developed in there.
Thank you. Thanks for mentioning that. I am very proud of that book. It's my favorite book that I've written, and it was the most fun.
Yeah, and you can feel it. Actually, you feel that you had a lot of fun with the dialogues. Perhaps I am stretching the comparison, but it reminds me a little bit of what Neil Gaiman made with Good Omens in collaboration with I forgot the name of the
Terry Pratchett.
Terry Pratchett. I can't believe that I forgot. It reminded me a little bit because of the interaction of the angels. So it was like really fun and really interesting. So that's
thank you. That's what I love that book. I love Good Omens. So I take that as a great compliment. Thank you.
And Blanca, for example, in case that the people want to follow you, it will be really easy. Also in Twitter, you are as a Nuclear Wolf 79. It's really easy to find you in there. And you are actually producer of a different show that we recommend you to follow tomorrow. It's usually being broadcasted on Wednesdays nights, right?
Yes, at 11 o'clock during the nights. It's about horror cinema, horror literature, horror comics, and tomorrow we will having a special program on film noir. We have a special guest, Ivan Farias. He's a Polish gender writer. It's going to be nice. And also I like to about the show tell you a little something about the show that's coming next week. It's about comics, and we have also an extra special guest. I hope you know who I'm talking about. I'm talking about Dan Campos. I don't know if you ever heard about him, but he's going to be next week with us. results.
All right, so hopefully you won't be losing a lot of subscribers after I appear on the show.
Surely not.
So there you have it. It's really easy to find. Just a brief recap in Twitter if you want to follow them. In twitter.com Tregillis and twitter.com nuclearwolf79. It's the easiest way to continue the conversation that we have in there. In here, and remember, people, if you like what we are doing here, we have a Patreon page, and currently we are moving forward with the participation of the people who believe in this project. As if you like this kind of transmissions that we're having, we have a conversation with film directors, writers, in this case, novel writers, but believing that this was. I like to go away from cinema to talk with authors as Ian Tregillis, because the work that you're doing, Ian, is really, 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 really awesome. So
thank you.
It's worth it for the rest of the people. Just turn off your screen and go read something. And here you have something that you can read that is really, 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 really cool. So if you like this kind of chats, go to patreon.com/churros y palomitas, churros y palomitas. So, and with this, we are finishing transmission. Ian, thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome. Thank you very much. This was a blast.
And Blanca, we will be talking for next transmission, because you are actually an executive producer of this program too. So we will be in touch. Everybody, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan. I'm very, 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 very pleased to having meet you, Ian. Thank you very much.
Likewise, this is a great pleasure. Thank you.
All right, and we go off with the animation as soon as I find it up there.